In a healthy society, staying is supposed to be the neutral choice. You study, you work, you gain experience, you build a life step by step. You may not get rich quickly, but at the very least you expect this. That effort today makes tomorrow a little better. And even when life isn't perfect, you feel like you're moving in the right direction. But what happens when the most rational choice for a capable person is no longer to work harder, but to leave? Not because they failed, not because they're lazy, not because they hate where they live, but because staying no longer produces progress. When staying stops being neutral and starts becoming a slow form of self-erosion. At that point, this is no longer a personal story, as it's a system problem. Over the past few years, a sentence has been quietly repeating itself across Reddit and finance forums. I respect myself too much to stay in Canada. Not once, not twice. From immigrants with stable jobs, from middle-class professionals, from people who did everything they were told to do. They aren't saying Canada collapsed. They aren't saying the country is broken. They're saying something much harder to hear. That staying is no longer worth the effort. This isn't panic, it isn't impulsive, it's a decision made. After years of trying, years of waiting, and years of telling themselves that things would eventually improve. And here's the uncomfortable part. The people making this decision are not the weakest ones in society. If only the unsuccessful were leaving, that would be normal. Every country has people who leave and people who stay. But when capable, skilled, productive people start seeing exit as the rational option, the issue is no longer individual. The issue is how the system rewards effort. Think about how effort is supposed to work. You work, you earn, you save, you invest. You build something over time. Each step may be imperfect, but the overall direction is upward. Effort doesn't disappear, it compounds. But in a system where housing prices rise faster than wages, debt stretches instead of shrinking, capital flows into assets, not productivity. Effort doesn't vanish, it simply stops compounding. You're still working, you're still busy, you're still playing by the rules, but year after year, you're not in a meaningfully better position. In Canada, many people aren't getting poorer, they're getting stuck. Same job, same routines, same stress, without the sense of forward motion. And being stuck for too long is often more dangerous than falling quickly. When people hear that effort no longer leads to progress, they often assume it's about motivation, that people stop trying, but that's not what's happening. Most people are working just as hard as before, often harder. The problem isn't effort itself. The problem is where effort gets absorbed. In a system dominated by housing, effort doesn't disappear. It gets redirected. Extra income doesn't go into savings. It goes into higher rent. Raises don't create breathing room. They get absorbed by higher mortgage payments. Longer hours don't lead to ownership. They lead to longer debt timelines, so effort still exists. But it stops building momentum. It becomes maintenance. And maintenance feels very different from progress. In a healthy economic system, debt is supposed to shrink over time. You borrow, you pay it down. With every payment, your ownership increases. But when housing prices outrun wages, that relationship breaks. People pay every month. They don't fall behind. They follow the rules, and yet, year after year, their effective ownership barely improves. Same payments, higher balances, longer timelines. That shouldn't be possible. But once housing becomes the primary store of wealth, the system quietly stops rewarding payoff. It rewards permanence. Debt doesn't disappear, it stabilizes. And a society built on permanent debt produces very different behavior. What makes this dynamic so hard to see is that it doesn't look dramatic in daily life. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses overnight. People still pay their rent, they still make their mortgage payments, they still show up to work every morning. From the outside, everything looks functional. But inside the numbers, something strange is happening. Take rent. Every year, rent rises just a little faster than income. Not enough to cause panic, not enough to trigger emergency headlines, just enough to absorb any progress. A raise doesn't change your life, it stabilizes it. A bonus doesn't create freedom, It fills a gap that shouldn't exist in the first place. Now look at mortgages. People aren't defaulting en masse. They're paying on time. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And yet, ownership barely moves. The timeline stretches. 25 years becomes 30. 30 becomes 35. You're not falling behind, but you're not moving forward either. Month after month, effort converts into obligation, not progress. And over time, that does something subtle to the mind. When effort stops improving outcomes, people don't rebel immediately. They recalibrate. They stop asking, how do I get ahead? They start asking, how do I avoid slipping backward? Life becomes a series of defensive decisions, not ambitious ones. You don't choose the best option. You choose the least fragile one. And that mindset doesn't show up on balance sheets, but it shapes everything else. Once effort stops compounding, staying stops being neutral. Staying begins to mean something else. It means accepting that the future will not be better than the present. And from that moment on, the system starts producing very strange decisions that nevertheless make perfect sense. When housing absorbs most available capital, it doesn't just affect buyers, it affects everything. Money that could have gone into businesses goes into down payments. Savings that could fund innovation get locked into property. Risk-taking declines not because people became cautious, but because the margin for error vanished. Starting a business feels irresponsible. Changing careers feels dangerous. Even taking time off feels risky. Effort doesn't create options anymore. It creates obligations. When effort turns into maintenance, it doesn't just affect individuals. It changes what the entire economy produces. In a healthy system, capital flows toward productivity. New businesses, new tools, new ideas. Risk is rewarded because the downside is survivable. But when housing absorbs most available capital, that flow reverses. Money that could have funded companies gets locked into down payments. Savings that could support innovation get buried in property taxes, insurance, and interest. Risk doesn't disappear. It becomes unaffordable. Starting a business feels reckless. Changing careers feels dangerous. Even relocating for opportunity feels risky because the cost of re-entry is so high. So people stay put, not because they're satisfied, but because movement has become expensive. Over time, this creates a strange paradox. The economy looks active. Transactions continue. Construction cranes stay in the air. But fewer new things are actually being built. Not fewer buildings, fewer futures. When capital is tied up in preserving value, instead of creating it, growth doesn't die. It stagnates. Productivity flattens. Innovation slows. And effort becomes increasingly disconnected from meaningful improvement. This is how an economy can stay busy, while quietly going nowhere. And that shift is subtle, but incredibly powerful. When staying no longer feels worth it, society doesn't collapse overnight. There's no dramatic crash, no single breaking moment, just quiet shifts. Capable people leave, not all of them, just enough. Long-term thinking weakens. Decisions become shorter term, not because people changed, but because the system stopped rewarding patience. A country doesn't need to lose population to be damaged. It only needs to lose the people who believe their effort still matters. And when that happens, the damage doesn't show up on charts right away. It shows up in everyday choices, where people live, what risks they take, what futures they stop planning for. This pattern isn't uniquely Canadian. Canada just makes it easier to see. You see it in parts of Europe. You see it in Australia. You see it in major US cities. Different policies and different cultures, same outcome. When housing dominates the economy, growth doesn't disappear. It freezes. The system keeps moving, but nothing new gets built. And when growth freezes, people don't revolt. They adapt, quietly. This is where many analyses stop. They say that people are adjusting. But adaptation is not the same as health. People adapt to stagnation. They adapt to compression. They adapt to lost futures. They delay families. They delay ownership. They delay ambition. Not because they want less, but because wanting more feels unsafe. An economy can function while slowly training its people to expect nothing better. And that is one of the most dangerous states a system can reach. The most dangerous part of this phase is how normal it looks from the outside. GDP is still growing, cities are still busy, cafes are still full, but internally a psychological shift has already occurred. People stop asking, how do I build a better life here? They start asking, where will my effort be wasted the least? That is the moment a country begins exporting its own people, not because they hate it, but because they no longer trust it. To reward commitment. When effort stops compounding, the damage doesn't stop with one generation. Parents start planning differently. Instead of helping children build independence, they plan to subsidize survival. Instead of upward mobility, the goal becomes damage control, a society that once promised progress quietly transitions into inheritance management. Who your parents are starts to matter more than what you do. That's not inequality as a headline. That's inequality as structure. Over time, people stop talking about opportunity. They talk about coping. They don't ask, what could I build? They ask, how do I avoid falling behind? And when a society reaches that point, the most capable people don't become angry. They become pragmatic. They leave. At this point, people often ask the obvious question. If this system is so inefficient, why doesn't it correct itself? Why doesn't housing fall back in line with wages? Why doesn't capital move elsewhere? Why doesn't policy intervene decisively? The answer is uncomfortable, because the system is doing exactly what it was redesigned to do. Housing isn't just shelter anymore. It's collateral. It's political stability. It's a store of national wealth. A sudden correction wouldn't just hurt prices. It would expose balance sheets. It would force recognition of losses that have been deferred for years. So the system chooses preservation over repair, stretch timelines and extend debt, delay consequences, not because it works better, but because it hurts slower. And while this avoids crisis headlines, it creates something else instead. A long, quiet erosion of trust. People stop believing that patience pays off. They stop believing that effort compounds. They stop believing that staying loyal to the system will eventually be rewarded. And once that belief is gone, no stimulus can bring it back. That's why this phase lasts so long. Not because people are blind, but because everyone is adapting. Just enough to survive, and adaptation, when prolonged, starts to look like acceptance. When staying becomes self-destruction, leaving stops being a moral question. It becomes a rational calculation, not because people stop caring, but because the system stopped reciprocating. And the real danger isn't that people leave. The real danger is what happens when the people who stay start making decisions as if progress no longer exists. That's where we're headed next. Because in the next video, we'll look at what happens when people don't exit the system, but instead learn how to survive inside it, when bad decisions start to feel rational. If this video helped you see the system more clearly, not angrier, just clearer, consider subscribing, because once you understand how a system actually works, you get to decide how much of your life you're willing to sacrifice to it.